react. You whisper in my name, thinking I won't be the same. Turn fiction into fact. See what you didn't know, bruises that I'll never show, slipping on your every jab. So tighten up your fist, step into the ring with this. I hope your mama's got your back. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, pulling the sound of my name in the crowd. You did a bust. Oh, 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 oh. You did a bust. Oh, 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 oh. Just 'cause I took a break, you're making a huge mistake, thinking you can take the throne. Look at you trembling, step into the lion's den. Bet you wish you stayed at home. Begging for mercy underneath your breath when I ain't even sweating yet. My legend's written in the stone, yeah. You're crying age in defeat is now your only friend. Even your mama's gotta know. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, pulling the sound of my name in the crowd. You did a bust. Oh, 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 oh. You did a bust. Oh, 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 First round, fifth round, final round. Oh, yeah. First round, fifth round, final round. No, 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 no. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, holding the sound of my name in the crowd. You did a bust. Oh, 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 oh. You did a bust. Oh, 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 oh,
Hi, this is Penn. Penn Jillette, Penn and Teller. Big guy does magic. Smaller guy next to me, he does magic too. He doesn't talk that much. Anyway, I wanted to welcome you to In Time. Welcome you all to In Time with Nick. Love you all. Peace. Go get him, Nick.
Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone, to In Time. My name is Nicholas Lamar Suter. Thank you for joining us. We have had on a guest that we've had quite a number of times. He's reasonably experienced, somewhere between 6 and 10 times. Really good guy, and knows a tremendous amount about biology. He's come on a lot to talk to us about COVID, and it's always a delight having him on. He hasn't been on in some time. We tried to book him today, weren't able to do it, so we got Homozygote instead. Homozygote, how are you?
Oof, I'm having a pretty good day. A little helter-skelter, slightly discombobulated, but otherwise doing pretty well. Just staying warm and kind of on my usual research grind, and now here I am. So thank you for having me. It's always a good time to be here.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I'm bummed. We wanted to get his andering. He's like, he's a trucker, and so I was talking to him earlier, and he said, "Yeah, I'm trucking a battery, so I gotta, I may or may not be available." I was like, "A battery, like C's, D's, like a double A? What do you? I mean, that's no, it is a Tesla battery for a wind farm." So I forget what he said. It was like 32,000 pounds or something like that. I mean, several car loads weight, and he's oversized and all this other stuff. I was like, "Whoa, that's that's a battery." Jesus.
Yeah, and Tesla has a predilection for batteries catching fire at a higher rate than other EVs. So that's a spicy bit of transport that he's got going there.
He was going through the mountains. There was a whole snow thing, so I was like, it may work out for him. The battery catches on fire. He just sits there and
we'll keep it nice and cool.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, well, speaking of, so we actually went live when the train crashed in Palestine, Ohio. I think was it West Palestine? I think it was West Palestine, Ohio. We covered it because it had the potential to be a huge disaster, and yeah, there's been a lot of talk about conspiracies and stuff like that. We've had on, you remember, Mr. X. Dr. Conspiracy, we had him on to talk about conspiracies. We looked into it. I'm not too big, what these things derail actually. I think it's where they're saying on average 4 derailments a day across the U.S., if I remember correctly. So, it happens. We just happen to be paying attention. It was, a slow news cycle, but now everyone's like, there's another derail, and another, and Texas, and Carolina, and so we're not really all that worried about this kind of thing. We also found footage of it with what appears to be the brake on one of the cars. Each of the cars has their own brake, and it has to, because if you disconnect the car from the rest of the train, you need to keep the car from going anywhere. So 100 cars, each with its own brake. They have to check manually to make sure each brake is off. Looks like they may have left one on. It heats up. It can actually melt the wheels, and boom. So it looks like all that was completely benign. However, what was not benign was the cargo that they were carrying. Could you tell me a little bit about that cargo?
Yeah, the cargo is really at the heart of the story. Every time we talk about this, it seems like there's a new revelation about like either what was on the train or like what the chemicals on the train are actually up to. So, initially, I'll try and tackle this chronologically because it's very difficult to like figure out where to start. The initial reports were about one of the train cars having a very ample amount of a chemical called vinyl chloride in liquid form. So this is the monomer, or sort of the chemical building block of PVC. So PVC standing for polyvinyl chloride, poly meaning many. If you think about PVC pipes, vinyl chloride is what gets slapped together to make PVC, that material. So that was
it's important. We use it it's a regular thing that would need and keep around.
Yeah, so vinyl chloride is definitely used in industry to produce a variety of things, including PVC. So it's a more common chemical than some of the other ones in this mix on the totality of the train. But there was one car specifically dedicated just for vinyl chloride in liquid form. So they were carrying about 100,000 gallons, which adds up to like 1 million pounds, I believe, in terms of actual like weight. We're talking 100,000 gallons of vinyl chloride, which is quite a lot. I don't know enough about the industry to know if that's like a standard amount that is transported, but regardless, vinyl chloride in particular is like the chemical at the center of the story. And a lot of that has to do with, of course, the human safety and toxicology behind it. Essentially, vinyl chloride is a very potent carcinogen, and in the very acute sense, it can cause a lot of respiratory distress, burning, itching eyes, scratching of the throat, difficulty breathing, or pretty much anything you can think of. Acute vinyl chloride exposure is actually quite hazardous. So, with that being said, the vinyl chloride posed the biggest, most immediate issue when the train derailment first happened. What was noticed was that the vinyl chloride car was leaking a bit, and the car itself had a pressure gauge on it just in case the internal pressure was rising within that vinyl chloride car, and it had like a valve to start releasing some of it. Vinyl chloride normally at most temperatures is going to be in the gas phase, so in some capacity to transport this in liquid form, there has to be some amount of like pressure in that car to keep it in the liquid form. So as the train derailed and the pressure started increasing inside of the vinyl chloride car, the valve essentially opened and was releasing vinyl chloride gas into the air. And that, I don't know if that necessarily gave them the idea or that this is the standard protocol for a situation like this, but the immediate response by people to that vinyl chloride car was to start combusting all of the vinyl chloride as it's coming out. And on top of that, they actually used some detonation charges to blow some extra holes in that car to allow the liquid in that train car to vaporize. And then subsequently, they were going to burn it. So this is what people have probably heard as what was termed the controlled burn. That's what they were doing. They were trying to burn off the vinyl chloride to chemically react it away to avoid whatever health hazards it might pose. So I know I went a little bit into extra detail, but the vinyl chloride in particular is one of the biggest issues with the Ohio derailment, because that chemical is a very nasty carcinogen, and also, again, causes respiratory irritation, eye irritation, a lot of immediate acute human safety issues.
Well, it's also, is that the one that was, I've now forgotten, chemistry was not one of my stronger suits. That's also actually was used as a chemical weapon in World War I. Killed, if I want to say 70,000 people. That sounds high for World War I, but heavy gas rolled down the hill and into trenches.
Yeah, so that's subsequent to the actual combustion, the burn off of vinyl chloride. Again, one of the reasons they wanted to burn it was, of course, the safety, but the fact that train car was so pressurized and that the pressure gauge was releasing extra vinyl chloride gas because the pressure was so high, they wanted to really get to it before it exploded. And one of their biggest concerns is it was going to destroy the town or a decent chunk of it if the car itself exploded with all this vinyl chloride in it. And when you burn vinyl chloride, what you just referred to, that's phosgene. So that's one of the byproducts of the vinyl chloride combustion reaction is a gas called phosgene, and that was the gas used during World War I, as you described, that was used on enemy combatants to kill them. And that's because, like you said, it's a very heavy gas that sinks. It's more dense than air, so it's going to sink and be more breathable, right? That was a very readily accessible and, I guess, producible chemical weapon during World War I years. Now, what kind of gets lost in the details is that when we're talking about when you burn vinyl chloride, what products do you get? Phosgene is, I think, one of the more minor products of that reaction. But if we think again about how many gallons of vinyl chloride we're starting with, or if we're talking 100,000 gallons, the reaction is happening at such a profound scale that very quickly after this burn, phosgene exposure is going to be an immediate concern. And in some of the early air quality tests that the EPA has done in the area, they were specifically testing for phosgene. The other product that they were very much concerned about is hydrogen chloride. And when that reacts with water in the air, you get hydrochloric acid, meaning people were concerned about acid rain. So that was, I think, the two most immediate concerns as a consequence of that burn off of vinyl chloride were the phosgene sinking and hurting people, which is why they evacuated the town when they did the burn off, and hydrogen chloride producing acid rain. Now, the hope when they did that control burn of the vinyl chloride was that all of these nasty products would be, in the vapor phase, in the gas phase, like they would be in the air, they would rise into the air, and over time they would sort of disperse and dilute, and the wind would essentially take care of that and blow this essentially chemical cloud away from East Palestine, so the residents could come back at some point in time. That was the mindset behind all of the handling of vinyl chloride, but I'm not really sure that was communicated effectively to the residents. I think they were just told they need to evacuate because they have to burn off some of the chemicals without any knowledge of what hazards are still sort of latent in that situation even after the burn.
This is what it looked like, and if you were a resident, what you were seeing essentially coming at you when they were in the process of doing this. Now, before we get entirely into this, it was being sent in liquid form. So my two questions are, why transport it as a liquid, and why was the pressure rising after it had derailed?
Yeah, I think, again, as far as the liquid transport is concerned, this is really like what you have to do with it, because vinyl chloride will readily vaporize. The chemical properties of vinyl chloride means at most temperatures it's going to be a gas, so you can't transport it in the industrial bulk that you need if you're trying to transport it in gas form. So that's why they're going to sort of probably pressurize it and get it to essentially be in liquid form. So
you can transport more if it's in liquid. You just need one tanker to transport a huge amount of it.
Right, and a lot of this goes back to industry regulations, because one of the more political aspects of this situation was the fact that during the Obama years there were actually loosening of the safety rules insofar as transporting hazardous chemicals are concerned. Right, they in the Obama years were actually recommending very strict regulations and classifications and definitions of hazardous chemicals. And if a certain chemical such as vinyl chloride happened to fit those very strict definitions, additional safety measures to prevent something like this would have been taken. So this is something that they're aware of in terms of why they're transporting it in liquid form, and how this could potentially be a safety hazard if a train derailment were to occur and you're starting to get either damage to the car or some other aspect of the derailment causes the pressure to rise inside of that car, and almost turning this into a ticking vinyl chloride bomb, so to speak. Unfortunately, the railroad industry very heavily lobbied Congress to get those hazardous materials classifications weakened and kneecapped. So the railroad industry didn't have to shell out the extra money to abide by the more strict safety precautions and probably transport guidelines for hazardous chemicals such as vinyl chloride.
Not your area of expertise, but we do know that there's been essentially threats of strikes across railroads. They say that they've been having to work a lot harder. The railroad industry is making more money than ever in the United States, but they're paying their workers less. They're laying off workers and making the workers who stay do extra time. So they were threatening to strike, and Biden and Congress came in and essentially forced them into a deal, since the railroads need to keep operating. At least that's what they said. So this not being your area of expertise, if you feel comfortable because you've looked it up, or without guessing, but if you happen to have looked into it, do you think that, has anyone claimed that played a part in this, or that we can expect more hazardous derailments since the workers are in such dire straits in the railroad industry, or not? What if you looked into it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think what I've essentially been telling people is that the path from deregulation to this train derailment is pretty clear. And in the process of that deregulation, the railroad workers and the railroad union in particular, they have been trying to draw attention to this for an extremely long time, right? They've noticed that pressure from the railroad industry, especially in a post-pandemic scenario where after COVID hit, there's a lot more attention drawn to the supply chain and a lot more desire from the railroad industry to actually transport chemicals in bulk at a larger amount to try and again continue to profit. to make what their shareholders are expecting them to make. Right, the railroad workers were essentially saying, "Look, like we're stretched thin. There are too few of us to do this, and in order to get the jobs done, we have half the workers that we need to actually conduct safe inspections of rail cars. The amount of time that we spend inspecting each car has decreased from 3 minutes to 90 seconds per car. These are things that railroad workers have been reporting themselves. So they essentially have said this is incredibly unsafe, and we're scared that this is going to lead to an increase in derailments or other accidents and safety risks insofar as transporting things on train are concerned." And this recently reached a head with the Biden administration as they literally actually made it illegal for rail workers to go on strike because they're so crucial and important for the supply chain. And I actually personally would have hoped that the rail workers would have engaged in a wildcat strike and said, "Okay, we're going to strike anyways, and if you want to arrest us, then arrest us, but that doesn't look good for you." So with that being said, they were absolutely willing to go on strike to draw attention to these safety issues that they've been facing. They're understaffed, they're overworked, definitely underpaid, lack material benefits, lack sick time, which they still haven't gotten. That they're still they're probably working and getting COVID or getting sick with something else left and right. These chemicals that they're probably transporting also pose an occupational hazard. So their working conditions have been absolutely abysmal. And safety and the safety of the actual materials in the cars, that is a big component of that. So the labor aspect of this situation absolutely played a role because it displays a very clear and present set of actions from the Biden administration to minimize that, to not actually address the material conditions that the laborers were complaining about. And those complaints were entirely valid and correct.
All right. So, and in general, if you want to strike, you have that right. But if you are declared in a critical infrastructure area, the government can actually legally compel you to keep going. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's precisely what happened. They were deemed too essential to strike because the supply chain would have really ground to a halt if rail workers nationwide went on strike, which I think only speaks to how powerful they are in terms of laborers.
So, 𝗲𝗄 is, if I recall, a class 4 chemical weapon, meaning that the Geneva Conventions have banned it, but the components are in fact needed for other common usage. So you can't use it obviously in war, but the gas does have uses. So what happened when they did this burn to the air? Now they evacuated everybody to within a mile, or everyone from a mile was required to evacuate. So they decided they were going to attempt a burn before an explosion. There were reports that there had been an explosion, so maybe we can get some clarity on that if you know. And then we also know that some people said they were going to stay. So what happened?
Yeah, so I think the initial reports of an explosion were because other cars actually caught fire. I could dig up sort of the early EPA report along with the chemical manifest, because they actually do list car by car what car was carrying what chemical, did it catch fire, yes or no, and then what they did, what was the outcome with respect to that specific car. So the picture you showed earlier with that giant smoke plume, that was very much likely to due to one of the other cars that caught fire after the derailment. So it wouldn't surprise me that if there was an initial explosion, that's what people heard, and that's what people saw was one of the other cars actually lighting on fire. I don't know actually how many people wound up staying. If I remember correctly, they did manage to get most, if not everybody, actually out of the town before they did the controlled burn. That happened only 2 days after the derailment. So I think the crash happened on the 4th, and then the 5th they were working on assessing the situation and then made that recommendation that okay, we have to evacuate because we need to burn off the vinyl chloride. And if anything goes wrong, then they don't want people to be there, especially because that burn off, again, necessitated them strapping charges to the vinyl chloride car to punch extra holes in it so they could actually release more of the chemical and sort of relieve the pressure.
So, and again, on the grounds that it's contained, anything that catches on fire in a contained space essentially is going to end up in an explosion. And in this case, it's a gas that you don't want distributed. So they burned it. Did
Right.
the burn create the Pfizer gas? And if so, what happened to it?
Yeah, so just knowing the chemistry of what happens when you burn vinyl chloride, yeah, phosgene is absolutely one of those byproducts. The hope was that, I think if I remember correctly, the folks, the residents of East Palestine, were let back in a couple days after the controlled burn. So I think what they did was they gave time for phosgene and some of the other byproducts to dilute into the air and let the wind sort of spread phosgene, the hydrogen chloride, and any of the other chemical byproducts away, essentially, from East Palestine. I think if I remember correctly, at the time, the wind directions were like blowing more like east-northeast, so we're talking like towards Pennsylvania, and then by extension like up maybe towards Toronto, and then people were speculating the wind direction would then take some of those chemicals and blow them back west into Michigan over, I think, Lake Erie. But, regardless of whether or not the wind blew all of it, according to the EPA's air testing results, they haven't actually really detected much hydrogen chloride or phosgene. I think my greater concern with respect to the air is that they're not necessarily testing for the very long list of volatile organic compounds that could be generated by burning vinyl chloride, because it's not a very seamless chemical reaction where you get an exact amount of the handful of products that you expect. Right, you're probably generating a whole bunch of wild and wacky organic compound intermediates, along with hydrogen chloride and phosgene. So I think those two big ones have probably been diluted into the air somewhat. I think based on just how chemistry works, that makes more sense. And I don't necessarily have any reason to doubt the EPA's air quality testing, because I know they've been sampling the air like gangbusters. They sampled it on the ground, sort of at people level, and then they've actually sent airplanes up into the air above East Palestine to then take air samples and air quality readings there. And according to the EPA, those two compounds, the hydrogen chloride and phosgene, have not been detected in ample amounts, if at all. So it sounds like that component might have been successful to a degree. There might still be some sort of lingering cloud, but again, that goes back to my concern about whether or not they're testing for the full gamut of volatile organic compounds. I on their actual testing results, which I could send you, they do claim that they have sort of like a catch-all category for volatile organic compounds to catch a series of intermediates that could have been generated, and they haven't detected those either. So if we're to trust the EPA, which might be difficult for people, especially in the aftermath of things like Flint, Michigan, among other environmental catastrophes, if we're to trust those EPA testing results, then the air is probably more safe than people are giving it credit for, which is why they let people back into the town. But I still think there are other considerations about the health and safety of the residents of East Palestine that are more of an issue. And for me, that's the water. I'm actually extremely concerned about the water, and some of the EPA's early testing results about the water, I think, share or delineate rather my concern. I haven't seen on the EPA's website, and I should actually probably refresh this before I say that, just in case. Ooh, they actually just uploaded a new air summary, so I can actually give you some pretty fresh test results from the EPA.
We got a super chat. Let me. Do you want to look at that for a minute? I will hit the super chat and I'll make one comment that I want to make about a difficult. Sinister Porpoise, $5. Sinister, thank you so much for the super chat. We appreciate it. I'm glad computer science contributed very little to the disaster. Yeah, I can't think of too many disasters that computer science has contributed to, but I'm sure there's a couple, but probably not many. Super chat, support independent journalists. Trust me, the pay is lousy. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. We thank you very much. I really appreciate it. We do our best, and we also appreciate having on good guests and Homozygote. I'm sorry. I don't know why. You're getting my wrath today. I'm being very mean and snarky. We appreciate having good guests like Homozygote. I do want to also quickly add, so, you got a problem. I do tend to lean a bit more towards trusting government agencies than I probably should. I'm aware that that has been misplaced in the past and will be again in the future. One problem is, let's assume that the air is perfectly fine. Let's just assume it's perfectly fine. If people don't trust the agency, then they're going to assume it's bad. If the agency is trustworthy or not, if they say it's okay and you don't trust them, you're just going to say, of course they're lying. It's like, well, trusting aside, there's a possibility it's good. There's a possibility it's bad. And so, we have to try to make these kinds of determinations. But just because you don't trust an agency doesn't mean that the air quality is bad. So it's like this is a difficult thing to suss out, especially if you have trust issues. Does that sound about right? Do you think I'm being fair? Is that what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially since the start of the pandemic, and certainly in the aftermath of again things like Flint, Michigan, if we're approaching this from a more environmentalist perspective, right? It's not unsurprising that people don't trust government. I think the multiple administrations that we've had, probably since Reagan, have really driven that home with the continuous weakening of regulators, the continuous weakening of regulations, and in a broad sense, people don't feel like there are people in government who are actually fighting for them and their interests, but rather the interests of corporations, and I think by extension capitalism. So with that being said, it's not surprising that people feel that way. This is why one of the things that I've been calling for is for like a more like a transparent and publicly facing conversation about like the EPA's test results, and having people from the EPA, actually talk with the residents of East Palestine, to have a dialogue with them to show them these test results. Like, it shouldn't take me going on to their on-scene test result webpage on their website to then pull up a PDF. Like, is the conversation that we're having right now happening with the residents of East Palestine? I have no idea. I would hope so, but I kind of have my doubts when we've seen how government in its very deregulated pro-corporate form handle issues like this. So from my perspective, yeah, I don't necessarily blame them for not trusting government. I think they still currently have good reason to be skeptical of the safety of their town. I think from my vantage point, from the EPA's test results that I can see, my concern would be more, again, focused around the water as opposed to the air. Because when I'm looking through the most recent like air monitoring results, over the last day, I think the monitoring period ended at like 6 p.m. Or 6 a.m. Today, rather. Mm-hmm. If we're looking at volatile organic chemicals in an 8-hour screen time, I think the highest result that I see at any point during those 8 hours from any air sampling site was 0.22 parts per million, which is a very, very dilute measurement just at one single place. So most measurements are reading a big fat zero for organic compounds, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, explosive chemicals, hydrogen cyanide. Like the things that they're measuring for are not actually really being detected, if at all, if we were to trust the EPA's measurements. And right now, I don't have any reason to doubt their air quality measurements, right? There's no qualms about their methodology, the technology that they're using to do this at this time. That could potentially change if the situation evolves, or there's some sort of whistleblower that comes forward with new information. Then we can kind of reevaluate the air quality measurements that I'm looking at in that context. But we're not there yet, and we might not ever get there. So based on the currently available EPA air quality monitoring, I'm not all that concerned about the air. But if that situation were to change, then we would litigate that. We would cross that bridge if we were to get there.
So let's talk. I was going to also ask you about like the earth, if any of this can sort of stay in the ground and pose a problem later, and or if there's farming, which there appears to be in the area, could that be a problem? So let's talk. Start with, if you think water is the biggest, let's start with the earth just to get that out of the way. But however you want to approach it, let's talk about both the land and the water.
Yeah, so if we're talking about the land, there's going to be issues sort of in the soil immediately around the derailment area, because obviously when the train first derailed and chemicals of various sorts, including vinyl chloride, were leaking from it in some capacity, right? This is all going to be, I think, secondary to like the chemical properties of the individual chemicals in question, right? Some chemicals like vinyl chloride are going to be more readily vaporized, and they don't necessarily have like very long half-lives in the environment. They don't bioaccumulate, but that might be the case for other chemicals. So my concern is that like in both the controlled burn of the vinyl chloride and in the aftermath of the immediate derailment, some of these chemicals, whether it's the combustion intermediates of vinyl chloride or some of the other stuff on the trains, would have like leached into the soil and potentially by extension like the groundwater that they drink from, because East Palestine drinks from well water. So with that being said, it is absolutely plausible. I think that the context that's necessary is to talk about like individual chemicals, but certainly in the list of things that the EPA has tested for, it's plausible that some of these things are going to like leach into the soil and potentially by extension groundwater. And when they've been sampling some of these surface water samples, right, the table that I'm looking at is from the immediate aftermath of the derailment on the 4th. There were definitely some things detected past the criteria that say the water is not safe to drink because the chemical is in such abundance in the water samples. So I could probably do a little bit of digging to figure out if these actually do like accumulate in soil. If they're present in water, I think that's the more immediate hazard. But if they accumulate in soil, especially if they bioaccumulate in either like plants, crops, or like livestock, right? If people are growing their own chickens, or if they have their own cows that they're going to, you know, slaughter or get milk from or eggs from, then it's possible those chemicals could come along for the ride, and that would pose a more like long-term health hazard to the residents of East Palestine.
We've got two questions. One, has there been any independent testing that you're aware of? And two, has there been any precipitation in the area? And how might that affect these chemicals coming out of the air and going into either the water or the land?
So if I remember correctly, I think there's maybe been at least one or two storms. I don't think they were like really super significant in terms of the total precipitation. It's absolutely plausible that if you were to get a storm in the area in the aftermath, if there was anything lingering in the air, you know, it could potentially, you know, be brought back down into the ground by a rainstorm. But I think that's probably pretty unlikely at this point. I think maybe if we're talking about wind, maybe wind patterns might have blown something in the air back into town. But again, I think the air quality results kind of at this time make that less of an issue. I think I might have actually missed a part of that question, if you don't mind repeating it.
The second part, has there been any independent testing done?
The testing. So it kind of depends on your definition of independent, because the rail company who was essentially responsible for this train and the subsequent derailment, Norfolk Southern, they brought in their own independent contractor for like toxicology testing. And this contractor that they've used apparently was actually used by British Petroleum, you know, BP, in the aftermath of the Deepwater Horizon spill. And this contractor has actually been called out by congressional Democrats all the way back in 2010. In the aftermath of the Deepwater Horizon event, this contractor was basically denoted as a pro-corporate contractor that's going to, you know, bend the truth and make things look more favorable for corporations involved. And that if the sort of investigation, aftermath, and cleanup of the Deepwater Horizon spill was going to have any integrity, that BP needed to essentially fire this contractor, because this contractor is literally there to cook the books, so to speak. So the fact that Norfolk Southern has brought them on board to try and hand wave things away is a sign that, you know, there technically is independent testing, but it's not really exactly independent because it's a contractor known for helping out corporations in the aftermath of these kinds of things. As far as non-Norfolk Southern contractors, I haven't seen anything to my knowledge. I think there's a lot of like anecdotes about, or even videos, like you can just kind of see it, more empirical evidence that something's not right. Because right now you could go to like the creek that runs through East Palestine. I've seen many videos of people just like throwing a rock into the water, and you get chemicals kind of like bubbling up and forming that, like, you know, diesel fuel like rainbow sheen on the surface of the water in the creek that runs through the town. And in addition, there's like tons of videos of like dead fish that have floated to the surface of the water, that have run down the water, and that are still kind of sitting at the bottom of the creek. So in terms of, you know, the aquatic life and whether or not there are chemicals still like in the creek, that still seems to be at least a more immediate issue. I don't know if there's been testing beyond what the EPA did in the immediate aftermath on the 4th to actually look at the water. And I don't know if there's been any independent testing at all. I don't think the residents of East Palestine really have that capacity to do that right now. It's a very small town of 4,500 people, and it's probably going to take time to get lawyers and independent toxicology and chemical tests actually conducted. So if it's in the works right now, I'm not privy to it. But to my knowledge, I haven't heard anything about non-Norfolk Southern and non-EPA testing being conducted.
Well, and the testing, I know they were testing in the Cincinnati area. They were worried about, the chemicals getting to Cincinnati, which is obviously a huge fucking concern. But if you're living in the East Palestine area, or West, you're concerned about that area too. And apparently, the testing the water as it gets to Cincinnati has just from what I've seen, it looks like it's been a higher priority. That may just be selection bias. That's all I've found because that's what people talk about the most. But yeah. I'll also point out.
They did.
Please, you.
Oh, I was just going to sort of add on to that with the Cincinnati water testing, because I think the Cincinnati infrastructure, as far as the water testing is concerned, that's a bit more robust, and they're more able to sort of like test for these things and actually like chemically treat water to sort of account for these potential volatile organic compounds that might come along for the ride. And considering that's like a larger urban center, and that the creek from East Palestine dumps into the Ohio River, which will then contribute to Cincinnati's water, and then ultimately that feeds into the Mississippi, like downstream of East Palestine, literally and metaphorically. They're trying to sort of see if anything is flowing beyond. But again, I'm not sure the extent of their testing either. I did actually look at the Cincinnati water testing results. They claim they haven't seen anything. I'm not sure their results are as like immediately transparent as the EPA's, where I can see like the actual readouts in parts per million. But if they're the officials there aren't saying anything to the extent that there are chemicals there, they're saying everything seems to be clear for the time being. I think they saw a little bit of an uptick of various miscellaneous crap that they treated out of the water, according to them. That they haven't seen any big chemical signs of like, oh no, it's here. I haven't heard anything like that. So, I think at the very least, East Palestine is the biggest concern. As far as chemicals beyond that, so far nothing. That could change, but so far I haven't seen much of any reporting outside of that area.
The anyone hired to do quote independent research or independent testing by the company is worthless. They have to be viewed as worthless. There was I think you and I talked about this. There was a great video about the man who did the greatest damage to our species of anybody, killed the most people, done the greatest damage to the human race of any living or dead human being in history. It's not Genghis Khan, it's not Hitler. It's the guy who figured out that you could get rid of engine knocks in cars by adding lead to gasoline. And they leaded the gasoline. The lead was going into the air, and the scientists started to ask, is this actually a problem? And they were able to conclusively prove that it was a huge problem. You had to pull the lead out of gasoline like right away. It was affecting everything in human development. Lead is just one of the worst. It's a heavy metal. I mean, being exposed to it is absolutely toxic. And the gasoline companies that were putting the lead in, and I forget which company it was one of the named companies, that was putting the lead in, had on loads of independent experts saying this was the safest product you could. It's like drinking baby's milk. You could literally just go put the gas pipe right up to the tailpipe right up to your mouth and you'll be fine. And it was and if they hadn't have done that, the lead would have been out of the gasoline like 2 years earlier or something. It's really quite shocking. It's companies. They care only about the bottom line. To some extent, that's absolutely horrible. To some extent, it's not entirely their fault, because it's like almost this groupthink. It's like they're each just worried about what's best for the company, and then you end up hiring somebody like this, and there's nobody responsible. No one person ultimately. It's a nightmare. I've gone off. Sorry on the
no, you're fine.
Yeah, that's what I don't. That's why I don't. It's like if they're hired by it's worthless. It's absolutely worthless. We've seen too many times, and the BP is also another great example. So okay, let's assume you lived there. A, what kind of precautions would you take? B, what would you be most concerned about? So now we've got there are fish dying. There are people seeing this in the water. What would you be doing? What would you be thinking about? And how would you be approaching it if you had to live there?
Yeah, so this is the thing. Like, I think in the aftermath of this, until you get a very clear, distinct picture based on testing, both from the government and probably from somebody independent, not affiliated with Norfolk Southern, like you described, I would say anybody living in East Palestine, if they have the means to leave, then they should. I think my idealized world basically means the government, and maybe by extension Norfolk Southern, ideally Norfolk Southern, would be footing the bill for that, right? I would think if there was an effort to actually take care of those people, then Norfolk Southern would essentially be held accountable by the government and would fork over a hell of a lot more money than they have to actually relocate people out of that town until the situation is very well understood. When we're talking about water, the soil, the air, every aspect of their environment, I think needs a very thorough scientific assessment. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. The problem is, for any person who's trying to sell their home in East Palestine, nobody's going to buy that. Like, nobody's going to move in to a place like this that has been subjected to this current ongoing disaster. So that's why, again, I would expect, or I would hope, that Norfolk Southern would foot the bill as the government tries to hold them accountable for it, to get the people out of there. But generally speaking, I would say until the situation is like known and understood to the best degree possible, I wouldn't want to be there, especially if people are drinking well water and if they're eating locally grown food. It's not something I would chance myself. If it was me, I would leave. I would try to leave and either not return for a good long time, or just leave permanently and just kind of leave the place behind, which is, again, much easier said than done. But we're talking about your health. I would hope that people would be of the mindset that, like, your health is one of the most important things that you have, and the longer you stay here, if there is some sort of lingering hazard, whether it's in the water, something bioaccumulating, or even in the air, then you're subjecting yourself to potential increased risk of cancer or other medical complications. Because, again, some of these chemical intermediates, the vinyl chloride itself, they're definitely carcinogens, and stuff detected in the water very early after the crash, those are also carcinogens. So there's a very clear and present threat at the very least. We don't know how much it's been dealt with and how much is still lingering. I would say, again, if they can leave, they should. And I don't know if it's ever going to be safe to come back, but that determination, I think, will be made in the aftermath of a very robust data collection effort.
So if there are lingering chemicals in the water and or in the earth, and they are being exposed to them, what are some of the short-term effects that you'd be concerned about, and the possible long-term effects that you'd be concerned about?
Yeah, so I think that the short term, there are still definitely people both in East Palestine and even downwind of East Palestine. They've absolutely reported, when they're either going outside or when they are outside, they absolutely feel the sort of more acute effects of these chemical exposures, right? Their throat gets scratchy, they're coughing, they're having difficulty breathing, their eyes are itchy and watery, right? They feel dizzy and lightheaded. I think yesterday we actually heard like a clip from a mother of a 9-year-old who actually has asthma, who basically was just vomiting on their floor because of the potential chemical exposure that they're being faced with in East Palestine, right? They were trying to work on a school project, and the exposure just got to them, right? I think a lot of what still makes me incredibly skeptical is that people who are there and really don't have a choice to be anywhere else, they're still reporting, when they go outside or when they're trying to go about their days, they're being told it's safe to come back, so they're back, and they're sort of experiencing these symptoms. From what chemical, we don't know, and I don't even know if this is going to be something that's like completely provable, right? What in their environment is making these symptoms manifest? Is it water? Is it food? Is it existing in a school, right? The mother that I just alluded to said that a bunch of her son's classmates are having similar symptoms. So it definitely feels like there's still something going on and that we don't have a complete suite of information. I will absolutely say that. So again, a lot of this is going to be chemical specific, but generally speaking, a lot of the chemicals that we're dealing with and the combustion products of vinyl chloride, if they've managed to linger in the environment, the long-term effects that we're talking about mainly focuses around cancer, right? A lot of these chemicals are either known carcinogens or probable carcinogens. There's a lot of animal data that you can pull up on PubChem, which is essentially like a giant chemical repository that has a lot of toxicology and human safety data and animal safety data for some of these specific chemicals. Like what I wound up doing on stream yesterday was I went through the very early EPA water testing results and actually going along with people looking at some of the toxicology data for some of the chemicals that were exceeding the non-safe, non-drinkable water limit that were detected on the 4th. So cancer was definitely where all of that converged. So I would be most concerned about cancer in the long term. It is, I suppose, I think chat's kind of mentioning too, like it might be possible that people might be almost like noceboing themselves into it. The nocebo effect is where if you expect something bad to happen, your body will sort of manifest that. If I expected, when I take Advil that, my arm hurts, if I really convinced myself of that, then if I took an Advil, then suddenly my arm would start hurting, even though that's not like really a side effect. That's just kind of a very rudimentary example of the nocebo effect. But in a situation like this, where there's a very clear and present event that happened to them, it is plausible that people could be, noceboing themselves into having some of these symptoms. But to me, I think that feels less likely because, this is happening in children. Like that anecdote that I just told is not a one-off. Like children aren't necessarily going to have like the most complete understanding of the situation in front of them. Like they probably barely understand what trains do. Their experience with trains is probably playing with like a toy train. Like they don't really have the greatest conceptual understanding of the events unfolding. So to me, I think that makes the nocebo effect a lot less likely, and that a lot of what they're feeling and seeing are entirely legitimate. And that's why I'm more inclined to trust the lived experiences of East Palestine residents right now, and really expect increased and more thorough testing of water in particular.
Let me ask you a question. If you've noticed or if you've been aware, has the U.S. government and the associated agencies, have they said that the air is safe to return to, or that the town is safe to return to? Because those are two different claims. And most of the claims that I've seen is they've said the air is safe to return. But that's an interesting statement because it implies that it's safe to return, but it explicitly does not say that. And it's defensible in court later where you're like, we didn't say you could drink the water. We just said the air was safe.
Right. And that's the thing is like, it feels very slippery, right? It feels a little duplicitous, a little two-faced in a way to say like, yeah, we tested the air, all clear. But that doesn't talk about the water. That doesn't talk about bioaccumulation of chemicals, right? Some of these things take time to actually manifest. I know they were actually going from like home to home to like test people's stuff, like test people's home environments to see if there are certain chemicals present. And while that wasn't the case for a decent amount of the homes in East Palestine, it also kind of raises the question, like, what are you testing for? Are you only testing for a handful of things? Are you testing for a broad swath of things? Right? Some of the methodology still is not entirely clear there. And that's, again, I think that goes back to that notion of there needs to be a very public-facing and transparent conversation from the EPA and some of the local officials insofar as what that testing looks like, how they're doing it, what they're testing for, right? It shouldn't be relegated to a series of PDFs on the EPA website. Like they should be having press conferences. They should be having, town halls, potentially in a safer space than the ones in East Palestine, to actually communicate to the residents what all is going on. And in this vein,
I'd have it in East Palestine. I'd have it in East Palestine, and I'd invite all the people from the EPA, and I'd give them each a glass of water right from the nearby river, and say, "Let's have a discussion about the environment."
Yeah, you recreate the Obama Flint scenario. Make them get the bottle of water from underneath the podium, because that tells that reveals all.
We had a really good question from the live chat, so let me ask you again. So you're living there, but you've got enough money that you could maybe get a hotel for even a couple of months. You can maybe telecommute. How far away do you go? Where do you go? How far away would you personally feel safe if this was you?
Yeah, I mean, if the wind direction was to be trusted, if we're talking about the vinyl chloride burn and the chemical cloud generated from it, if that assessment of where the wind was blowing at the time was to be trusted, I would go west, so away from the direction of where that cloud was going. So I would not want to be downwind of that if possible. I think the farther west you would go, especially if you can find an area that doesn't necessarily rely on any of the Ohio River for drinking water, and that would probably be the most like detached you could get from it in sort of a quasi immediate area. I mean, if you wanted to go to the West Coast or something, like actually go across the whole entire country, then the farther away, the absolutely less likely you will feel the impact of the train derailment in particular. But if we're talking about immediate directionality from East Palestine, I would go west. If I was to stay in the state of Ohio, for example, I would absolutely go west away from the Pennsylvania border, because that's at least where the chemical cloud was alleged to have blown.
I do feel like I just realized I think I cut you off for the cheap joke there. So, did you finish your thought?
Oh no, you're good.
You had said okay. I want to make sure that we, I'll do anything for a cheap laugh. But on the flip side too, the reason you're here is because you know about these things, and we're glad to hear about it. So, I don't want to. But it was because you had just said I'll go far away. I was like no, bring the EPA guys downtown and say let's chat. So, all right, well, let's see. So it sounds like, if I can summarize this, and maybe you can tell me if this is an accurate summary. There is some cause for optimism when it comes to the air. We don't know, but we've had some testing. The testing appears optimistic. There is definitely some cause for concern with the water. If anything is dying in the water, I'd be concerned even without a chemical sheen coming up from it, so that's concerning. A longer concern is if the ground has absorbed any of this, short of people bought and paid for by the company. We don't have a lot of testing outside of this, and we don't know how broad that testing is. So right now, to the best of anybody's knowledge that I'm aware of, nobody has died from this, but we are seeing some would appear to be credible. We don't know for certain, but certainly appear to be credible examples of people getting sick. And so really more testing, and ideally get everybody out until we know. Is that roughly the takeaway that from everything you've said?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty decent summary. I'll kind of add two things into that mix, because my chat is informing me that the chemical sheen that I alluded to earlier, that's also a possible result of bacterial overgrowth in the water, which could be caused by a mass die-off of aquatic life. So the videos that have been posted online of people in the creek, in Leslie Run and other parts of the creek that either runs through East Palestine or just immediate on the outskirts, there have been very large die-offs of minnows and other very small fish. You can absolutely see schools of fish floating on top of the water that are very clearly dead. So that would make sense if you were to see that rainbowy sheen. It could be due to a bacterial overgrowth that is caused by the die-off of aquatic life. So that is a plausible hypothesis as to how that could be happening. And I think the answer to, is it chemicals, or is it because the chemicals got into the water and killed the fish and caused the sheen? Is it the chemicals themselves or the aquatic life death? How you answer that question is you go test the water. You go still see what all is actually in that creek, right? To my knowledge, the EPA hasn't posted any more up-to-date water testing results after the 4th of February. So it's been a pretty decent chunk of time, and that's the only water testing result that I've seen. So that makes me a little concerned about the water in particular. I don't know if they've tested since then and they've found something even worse or something else that we don't know about. I would like to see more up-to-date water testing, because they're testing the air again like gangbusters. So again, the lingering of things in the water might be responsible for some of the videos and pictures that are being posted on social media. It could be simply because the aquatic life was killed, not necessarily because there's a chemical layer sitting on top of the water. I think. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I've seen dead fish. I've seen dead fish before. You see some of that sometimes with significant quantities of dead fish on a lake or a creek or something like that. You do see it. So I do know what you're talking about. Anyways, please continue.
Yeah, I think the only other thing I would add is that a lot of the people in East Palestine, especially those who are like more farmer types or who like steward over animals, where they have like chickens and foxes and or even companion animals like dogs and cats. There have definitely been reports from some of those people that their animals have literally either died or had very similar acute chemical exposure syndromes. I know there was like one person who owned a couple of foxes, where the foxes were having diarrhea, they were vomiting, they were kind of foaming at the mouth, they were having respiratory distress. Somebody who owned a couple of chickens just found like a bunch of their chickens dead when they came back after the control burn, after the evac. Some people, even after coming back, have had chemical exposure symptoms being seen in their dogs. So it's possible. It's very possible that some of these things are still lingering in the environment and could be causing what people are seeing in the animals. So I think that also makes it more likely notion that something's still persisting that is causing some of this. If we're hearing reports about school children, adults in there outside, and even some of the animals, it's a pretty unique gamut of individuals and creatures experiencing symptoms of chemical exposure. So we can hope things get better with the passage of time. I'm still quite concerned with respect to the water specifically, and potentially the earth as an extension of that. If we're to trust the air results, then that's less of an issue for now. So that's kind of really all I would have to add. But I think aside from that, your summary of the situation is pretty straight on.
Well, and I do want to point out, I've seen the reports of the dead chickens and of a number of things, and that I've seen, all of those reports are they came back and then found them dead, which is different than we came back and brought them back with us. They had gone and then they died when we came back. So we have seen when people come back, if they brought their pets back, the pets have gotten sick. It does seem like, and the pets aren't, that's not going to be a nocebo. I mean, that's the pets aren't sitting there going like, I wonder if there's something in the air, and then just start, so the animals that are getting sick after they return strikes me as rather compelling. But the ones of mass deaths, it had kind of, people were taking those articles as, oh my God, you came back and then all your chickens died. No, you came back and they were dead because the burn off and clearly a very toxic gas struck the area. What's there now is the question. I certainly wouldn't be, I'm not being glib. I'm just like, so that's part of my question about the earth too. It's like I don't know that you can farm anything. It seems I would not be drinking the water if I was there. Period. End of discussion. Problem is, if you're living there, you're going to have to drink something. So
yeah, it's much easier said than done. I mean, ultimately, it's about subsidizing people escaping from East Palestine. I'm actually kind of surprised I haven't seen like a giant GoFundMe or something to get people out, because again, in my ideal world, the government should have been doing that a long time ago, just to make sure that people's lives are preserved and intact to the best of their ability.
Has anyone talked about the governor declaring a state of emergency, which would hopefully free up some funds and maybe getting federal funds in so that they can relocate these people, at least temporarily?
Yeah, they've absolutely talked about that. I know Biden actually called Governor DeWine of Ohio and said, look, anything you need, you got, you let me know what you want to do about it. And since that call, DeWine has not called Biden back. And it was DeWine himself who said that. He basically said, like, yeah, I haven't called Biden back. I'm not doing anything about it. So, like, straight up, the governor of Ohio was just like, yeah, I'm just operating on vibes. Things seem okay.
Yeah.
So, like, okay, wow, all right, this giant thing happened in your state, and you're just gonna let this slide. Like, almost makes me wonder if the railway industry is a big campaign donor for him. I don't know when he's up for re-election, but that kind of behavior seems very pro-corporate.
That's an interesting point. I haven't considered that. Yeah, I would look into where he's getting his money from. I've been looking into where the money for Cop City has been coming from, because we've been talking a lot about that, and that's interesting. That's an interesting deep dive, but that's for another show. All right. Well, I think that just about covers it. There were so many questions I had going into this that there's this part of me that goes, there must have been more questions, but that we really, I think, covered a lot. So I'm going to give the live chat a minute or two to catch up on any questions they may want to make sure that we ask before you leave. Is there anything you can think of that we haven't discussed in terms of what we're looking at, what the ideal scenario would be, and how it's playing out right now as opposed to that ideal scenario? Anything in any of those areas that we missed that you think is worth covering?
Yeah, I think we pretty much I covered the gamut. I think I guess one like parting message that I could leave people with is that a strong government that had regulators with teeth would have absolutely prevented this. In terms of the hazardous chemical materials classifications, that was, those regulations being kneecapped by political lobbying in 2014. The Trump administration actually came in and prevented the installation of electronic brakes on the trains, which would have essentially, in the event of a mechanical issue or an axle failure, like what we saw here, all of the train cars would stop at the same time with an electronic braking system instead of what we saw happen, where all of the train cars collapse upon each other like a slinky that is retracting. Right? If those electronic brakes were in place, the odds would have been high that the cars would have actually managed to stay on the tracks instead of derailing and spilling chemicals and causing the vinyl chloride car to start increasing in pressure, necessitating the burn off. So that would have been a very, very good thing to have on board. And then it's also worth noting, too, that the Biden administration, when they came into power, did nothing about the prior two administrations' deregulation of the industry. So the past three administrations have been very pro-railway industry, anti-railroad worker, and, in this case, anti-resident of East Palestine, because this is how the situation is manifested. So my parting message is that people should see that a strong government with appropriate regulations would have absolutely prevented this. So it's worth noting in the future that we should have an NTSB and an EPA that are working 24/7, 365 to try and prevent some of the 1,500 derailments per year that happen. Right? I think you alluded to at the very beginning that this is our first like really big look into train derailments as a phenomenon that happens, but it's unfortunately a very regular feature of America. And if we have a vested interest in making it stop, which I would hope we do, even if we can't get that 1,500 number down to zero, we want to try and get down as close as possible to zero and try to prevent as many of these things from happening as we can, instead of reacting in the aftermath and kind of half-assing it in some capacity, kind of like we're seeing now.
All right, and actually, I just got something about that, which apparently just now happened. So I'm going to discuss that. Thank you, Titan. Titan sent me it's on my DMs. I'll get to that in a second. Before we do, I had forgotten that you're always a delight to have on. But whenever we have you on, there are the trolls, the people who like you and stick with you. And now that you've been on, it took me 6, 7, maybe 8 or 9 times before I could identify some reading rap trolls that like to pretend like they're asking legit questions. But I'm on to you, sir. I'm on to you. But he's can Homozygote confirm whether or not the domestic cougar will be safe? I have a feeling that's a dirty question. That's I'm going to go with that, and so I'm not going to read it a lot. I think I just read it. I think he may have outwitted me on this one. Yeah, I'm sorry. What?
At this point, I don't think he has anything to worry about. I think if he wants the domestic cougars to be safe and not be exposed to chemicals, he should ride into East Palestine on a silver steed and evacuate them personally. So, I as long as they're not drinking the water, I think they're okay.
All right.
For the time being, but he needs to get them out.
All right. And Porpoise asked, well, I think essentially in a very snarky and funny way, what's the likelihood of this happening somewhere else? But before we do get to that, so Ohio governor, a medical clinic is opening in East Palestine. But on top of that, we've got, Ohio governor says FEMA will provide resources to East Palestine. They're deploying federal resources to the site of the train derailment. He announced Friday evening, so literally just a short time ago. This is coming in. I don't know what that means. At least if you're getting FEMA involved, that means some government money can be flowing in. If the resources is just a medical clinic, I'm not impressed. If the resources are moving people, that's a bit better. And as terrible as it sounds, the reality is you can get a lot of these people some housing that's it's not great housing, but you get them out of there. That's just if you're just putting them up in a place where they can have meals, water, and the basic necessities of life. I think that's sort of what it starts with, and that's actually not as hard to do as people think. Anyways. So I don't know what these mean. I was reading one of them earlier, and it was suspiciously political talk. But something's going there. I don't know what, and I don't know where it's going to go. A medical clinic is the most I can confirm so far.
Yeah, I mean it's a start, but that kind of makes me just think it's going to be like an urgent care. Like for people who are experiencing symptoms, they'll just go there and they'll be like, "Oh yeah, you seem fine. Go home." I'm very skeptical of how effective that's going to be. I want to, if it's even possible to see like if there's any accumulation of chemicals in people's bloodstream, or if there's any like testing in urine or something that can be done. Like that's the kind of thing that I want to see if based on some of the testing results, if we're talking about like water testing, if any of these chemicals are actually like starting to accumulate in people's bodies in sort of a quasi-acute time frame, like after the derailment to now, after people have come back, if they're starting to see any of this happen. That's the kind of testing I would like to see, but I think it's probably going to be geared more towards like treating acute exposure symptoms and really nothing else, because the medical infrastructure that was there pre-derailment was not the most robust anyways. So it's better than nothing. It's additional resources and hopefully like physicians and doctors, but I'm not sure that's going to be all that much of help if the actual source of the problem, chemicals, are not actually like detected and delineated in terms of where in the environment they are, and removed or remediated and to the best of their capacity. I know actually my chat, it's probably going to take me some time to actually go through this, but apparently they did actually just dump some fresh water testing results on a different web page, not associated with another one of their EPA links. So they actually do have some now up-to-date water testing results in like two different forums for East Palestine. One of the things that I can see, some of the things that they like highlighted in yellow is like, oopsie poopsie. One of the chemicals on one of the train cars, butyl acrylate, which is, I think, if I remember correctly, was at least in terms of animal carcinogenicity, it had some sort of risk for animals and potentially people. I think at the very least it was an immediate irritant. Okay, actually, yeah, they said no evidence for human carcinogenicity for butyl acrylate, but it's at the very least an irritant. But anyways, this chemical specifically was detected in elevated amounts in the water in East Palestine. There's a more like robust set of results for like a bunch of different chemicals that were coming from 𝗲𝐢𝐻, which is a third-party company. So it sounds like, I don't know if it was the EPA or East Palestine, but now it sounds like that independent testing that we're talking about might have actually occurred, and the results were posted on a different webpage a couple of days ago. So I will go through this, and I can DM a summary to you.
Please do. Titan has also CC'd some of this to your read content on your Discord. We just got this. The Ohio governor has now come out and confirmed that the creek that near the derailment is, quote, severely contaminated. And has said that it's going to take a significant amount of remediation, and that they have in fact been redirecting clean water around it so that the water doesn't go through and become contaminated. But that is just out. So the Ohio governor, reacting to that video that you were talking about, now confirms that, quote, it is the creek near the derailment is, quote, severely contaminated.
Yeah, I mean, at least from the one immediate chemical result with the butyl acrylate, that doesn't seem all that unsurprising. I actually just had chat clarify the more in-depth water testing summary coming from 𝗲𝐻. This was commissioned by the state EPA, not the federal EPA. So it sounds like the state actually commissioned an independent test, not associated with the federal government either. So it sounds like if I go through this, if the governor is now saying it's severely contaminated, I'm probably going to find a whole lot of stuff. So I think my suspicions were actually pretty correct about the water and not so much the air, which is unfortunate because that means if if the creek water was somehow associated with either drinking water or animal for like their livestock, then they've been drinking contaminated water. It sounds like they've been at least trying to route it so it doesn't flow down into the Ohio River and like down into Cincinnati. They've been routing it away. It sounds like they've almost like known about this for some time. I think that probably explains the like gap between the most immediate testing results from the federal EPA on the 4th and the release of these data on like the 15th and the 16th. So in the 12-day period, it sounds like they found some of this out and tried to take some action before they made a public announcement about it.
That's exactly what I was thinking, which is they've already started rerouting the water. It also means that they're not cleaning out the water that's there. If you reroute the water,
right? So where are they sending that water?
Well, yeah. The other thing, and this is the key. I do get the legalese, and I get that you have to cover your ass to some extent. But when they say, okay, the air is fine, it's safe to return, and again, you're really just talking about the air, not these other things. Eventually, it will come out that if the water is contaminated or anything else, and so you're not doing anything to improve the trust in the federal government, in these agencies, and ultimately, eventually, in like the CDC, FEMA, any of those things, all of that gets eroded. It's been eroded. It's been getting eroded over time, and trust in those agencies is actually really important. Doing the legalese and just saying, well, the water's clean, so or the water is safe to not the water, sorry, the air is safe to return, and doing this where we're playing the games and all this other stuff, and then people come back and get hit by the water. It's sort of like, okay, nobody's ever going to trust the EPA again, and yeah, that's not quite true. That's hyperbole, but I think you know what I'm saying, and that trust is
right.
Necessary.
Yeah, I mean, Chad also just said they announced this on a Friday night, so that's the typical media narrative, right? Announce it on a Friday night, so it doesn't get reported on as much. People don't see the reporting, through the weekend, and they'll maybe get like a diluted form of it on the following Monday. It's a Friday news dump.
Good point. Yep. The trash day, the news trash day. It's when they take out all that. So when all the stories you don't want anyone to talk about. Yep, I hadn't even thought of that either. So, yeah. All right. Well, I think that just about covers it. It's always a delight to have news break as we're doing the show, news about the show. It looks like the Ohio governor is now at least talking about this. My hope is he's going to do more than just get medical supplies down there. But I feel like you've given us a lot to work with. And as much as there are unknowns, we at least have a framework for understanding what the problem is, what needs to be known and understood going forward, and how to safely approach it. I don't know that those things are going to happen, but I'm glad that we know it. So thank you very much for coming on. Where can people find you?
Yeah, currently I do most of my streaming on Twitch, so that'll be twitch.tv/Homozygote, HOMOZYGOAT. I do have a YouTube channel where I'm currently working on a bunch of scripts for a pretty decent amount of videos when I can find the time in between studying and streaming. So that's something that I think that's associated with my Twitch. There will be like click-through links to my YouTube channel. I am also on Twitter. It's the same username with an underscore at the end. So those are the three places that you can find me. If people have more in-depth questions, or if they want to ask about other stuff that is probably more germane to my expertise insofar as like biology is concerned, those are the places to go. And I'm usually pretty responsive, especially on days where I am streaming like today. So thank you very much, Nick. It's always a pleasure to come on here. And your chat always has pretty like on the nose questions as far as like, okay, like what do we do? Where do we go from here? Maybe except for the domestic cougar questions from a certain chatter.
Yeah.
So
that wasn't my fault. I'm just my pleasure. And you've got a Discord too, and we will make sure we update the description with a link to that Discord. If you want to see people who know a lot more about this kind of stuff than you do, go join that Discord, because holy smoke. It's always a pleasure. Thank you once again. Let's see. It is Friday night, so Next week is going to be a little bit of a lighter week for us, but we still are going to have on Commander Lance McMillan for downtime on Thursday at 9:30 p.m. Eastern, and Operator Starsky on Friday at 1 p.m. For those who are asking, Operator Starsky did not show up to today's stream. We did the stream anyway. Lance is, as everyone here knows, very knowledgeable, so we were able to cover a lot of really great stuff. He's not in the battlefield, so we do appreciate it when we can have Starsky. People were concerned because he was supposed to come and he wasn't able to. There was the offensive in Kyiv, and that has upset most of his plans. So he is fine. I've been in contact with him since then. He was on his way home, but he had a number of all the commanders had called everybody in, and he's been up to his ears talking to brass, and we know that they've been talking about deploying him elsewhere, and his brigade has been moved up in the front, and all of these things going on. Suffice it to say, obviously, he had far more important things to do. But he expects to be back next week. He will be on the shills tomorrow. He is he is absolutely fine. He's just got back late. And so for those who are concerned, he's doing good. Thank you all once again. And we look forward to seeing you next week, Homozygote. Thank you so much. A pleasure as always. And, I'm sure we'll have you back if we have more questions.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you, Nick. Much appreciated.
All right. Night, everyone.